Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you today. My name is Mildred Gilman Wohlforth. I was born in 1900, and in 1930, I came here to live in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Lived here over 60 years with my beloved husband, Robert. Well, I became very early on in my life a well-known journalist. Now, I was different than other female journalists because I wrote about crime. I was back in the 1920s, the flapper days. There were gangland murders, there were trunk murders, there were pimps and prostitutes and bootleggers, and I was writing about all of them. And boy, I made so much more money than so many of the other women writers. Well, anyway, I did not come from this area. I was actually from Chicago. Grew up in a very educated, very eccentric family, and we all loved to write. By the time I was 12 years old, I had already published a couple of stories and been paid for them. Well, at that time, the very best school to go to for journalism was the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and that's where I went. While I was there, I actually wrote a number of books. But what I think is interesting is at this university, who also went there, Irene Campen from Ridgefield. She went there for the same reason that I did. She also married a writer like I did. She also lived in the town for many years. And like me, she went to New York City and started off as a secretary. While I was at the University of Wisconsin, I wrote 3 books. They weren't great, but for somebody that young, they were okay. I wrote one that was called The Changing West. I also wrote one that was called The Headliners, and then The Nutmeg. Oh, I loved writing. No matter whether it was fiction or nonfiction, I had to put my pen to work at all times. When I graduated, I went to New York City. Of course, you have to start as a secretary, but you could move up the line very quickly. Oh, I was so thankful. Haywood Braun became my first publisher and the first person that I worked with. He saw such potential in me, and he knew I could ask those hard questions. I was not afraid of anyone, and I could really get the material, the guts out of people. So that's when I began writing about the 1920, the flapper area. Oh, I loved interviewing the prostitutes and the pimps and the criminals, those in prison, the trunk murderers, the machine gun people. I interviewed them all. Now, the most famous case that I became the investigative reporter for was the Sacco Vanzetti case. This took place in Massachusetts. It was about the murder of a shoe factory owner. The 2 men that were accused were young Italian immigrants. There was no evidence against them, but people were xenophobic. People thought of Italians as minorities, and they wanted these men executed, and they were. After a while, Hearst became very interested in the work I was doing and asked that I come and work for them. So through that association, I started writing for Redbook and Reader's Digest, The New Yorkers, McCall, Saturday Evening Post, The American Mercury, and so many other publications. Now, in addition to criminal stories, I started interviewing celebrities. This was very interesting, and I still ask the hard questions. Oh, I interviewed Deanna Durbin. She was so beautiful. Jane Withers, she was so funny. Paul Robeson. Oh, Tyrone Power, those eyes, they were so dreamy. Well, after I interviewed Gene Kelly, he asked me to dance with him. Never will I ever forget this dance. And of course, when I interviewed the Marx Brothers, oh my goodness, it was just about impossible. They were no different in person than when you see them on screen. I interviewed Shirley Temple when she was older. Oh my goodness, this woman could do so much more than tap dance and sing. She was brilliant. Now, two of my most favorite interviews were with Amelia Earhart and Thomas Edison. Amelia Earhart knew so much not only about flying, but actually the mechanism of the plane. The interview that I had to work the hardest on was Thomas Edison. I didn't have a science background, and you have to know your subject matter when you get into an interview like this. Well, people said, you know, Mildred, you are so good. You interview all the presidents, people who are big in the State Department, the captains of industry, the wealthy, and the lowlife. But probably one of the most difficult interviews that I had globally was Hermann Goering. Hermann Goering was head of the Nazi Party. He was known for his war crimes. I was so surprised I got this interview. I gave him the questions ahead of time, so he was able to deflect to a certain degree, but actually, I got a lot of good information out of Herman. I was also scheduled to interview Hitler. Can you imagine if I had gotten to interview Hitler? Well, he read my Goring interview. I guess he got cold feet. I was actually in Germany waiting outside of his office to go in, and he canceled on me. Because of all my interviews of all different type, I was very happy to be part of what they call the Algonquin Club. This was serious, very well-known writers who got together to discuss writing as a craft. I was part of this group with Sinclair Lewis, Bennett Cerf, Dorothy Parker, Robert Benchley, and Chris Morley. Oh, this was one of the proudest moments of my life. Well, while doing all of these interviews and articles, I also wrote 9 books on my own, books of fiction, but I took all that I had gained about criminal life, about women, about celebrities, about money, about everything, and I wrote the Sob Sisters. There was actually one book called The Sob Sisters that was made into a movie, and the movie did very well. I did not give my books the title of the Sob Sisters series. Other people gave it to me. Now, why did they call it the Sob Sisters? They called it that because I wrote so compassionately and emotionally about the characters. When you read the books, you would sob for the victim. You would sob for the culprit. You would sob for their parents and kids. You would sob for the police. These books were deeply emotional. They were page turners. You would read them overnight. They were not predictable. I wrote about sex and violence, relationships and crime, all interwoven into one. Some of the other titles were Diary of Alice, The Woman Angel, I covered the crash, Fearless Francis, I Am Frigid and Safe Sex. I also wrote a memoir on my own life, which I thought was very good. Well, speaking of my own life, I want to tell you about my beloved Robert. While I was working at Hearst, I met him. He was working there as well. He was charming. He was sophisticated. He was smart. Oh, was I taken by his charm. Now, he had gone to West Point. He had a love-hate relationship with West Point, and he wrote this book called The Tin Soldier. I had read this book and enjoyed it way before I ever met him. Well, after he finished his military career, he went on to Princeton, and now all of my papers and materials and all of Robert's are housed in the Princeton Library. After his military career, my husband also went into business. He was very successful at business, but what he really missed was writing. So he decided to be a white-collar investigative reporter, and what a job he did with that. My goodness, the corruption he uncovered, the collusion, the embezzlement, the Ponzi scheme, the government, and how they were misusing money. Oh, it was unbelievable. And he wrote about it in such a simple, dramatic way. He was so good at uncovering white-collar crime. Roosevelt, during World War II, put him on the Antitrust Commission of the Justice Department, and he began writing for them. Oh, the McCarthy. That time came in, and oh, it took so many people down. And my husband said, no, I did not decide to work for the government and become involved in politics. I want none of this McCarthyism, so he left. He started his own publishing company, did very well. And both of us wrote up until our mid-90s. In 1930, we moved to Ridgefield. We both loved historic old houses, and we found the perfect house, 57 Rockwell Road. This house was the Benedict House, and Mr. Benedict was the shoemaker in early Ridgefield. The house was built in 1930. We loved it. We did not change one thing about the original structure, but we did add to the house because it was quite small. Now, what concerned us was the fact that this house could be torn down. When we were here, Ridgefield had no historic registry, it had no historic district. The town needed this facility. My husband and I bonded together and worked for this to happen. It did happen. Our house was the first one on the registry. And just think of how this group of individuals saved all these historic places in town. Right now, I'm sitting at the Ridgefield Historical Society Scott House. This house could not be here today without this registry. Well, in addition to that, my husband and I became involved with planning and zoning. We wanted the town to stay as much as it could as possible. We were realistic, however. My husband also became a great leader with the Ridgefield Library Board, the Conservation Commission. And he had great feeling and empathy for the Italian immigrants in town, and he began to help them gain citizenship. Meanwhile, I did extensive work in Danbury with the Planned Parenthood Association. Why would I do this? I had met and interviewed so many prostitutes, so many rape victims, so many women who had 12, 15, 20 children and couldn't have any more. Planned Parenthood at the beginning was so important, and just as important today. Well, my husband and I had two claims to fame in town as well. One was alone and together, we wrote more letters to the editor of the Ridgefield Press than anybody else in its history. Now, we did not just write these letters. We interviewed people, we went to all the meetings, we spoke up, we did our research. So when we wrote a letter, it had a lot to say. Now, also, my husband and I had another claim to fame. I was known as the eccentric old 90-year-old woman from Rockwell Road who rode 3 miles on her bicycle every day, no matter what the weather. Yep, that was me. My husband, oh, the Battle of Ridgefield 275th anniversary, he rode a white stallion as Benedict Arnold. Oh, we were always so happy and proud of this, and I knew he was always my knight in shining armor, but now he was for the entire town. And what is my message to you today? My message, I think, is a very strong one. That it's so important that if particularly this is your forever home, which is what they call it today, you need to join committees, to be on commissions, to go to political events, to read the local newspaper, to stand up and write letters to the editor. What you need to do is not just live in town. You need to thrive in town. You need to make a difference and leave a legacy.